Hello. Uh, Good afternoon or good morning for some of our participants today. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar on protecting HUD's equal access rule to HUD programs. My name is Marcy Thompson, and I am the Vice President for Programs and Policy at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, which is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to preventing and ending homelessness in the United States. I'm joined today by colleagues from several other national partner organizations, and collectively, we represent a growing coalition of concerned organizations standing together to take action. Next slide. Today's webinar will be recorded, and that recording and the slide deck will be shared with all attendees. Participants can share a message to any of the hosts and panelists at any point during the webinar, and we will use the chat to share resources with you all, but otherwise the chat is disabled. For questions, please use the Q&A box throughout the webinar to ask any questions of our participants. Next slide. All right. We just want to ask that you help us keep this space safe and inclusive throughout the webinar in the language that is being used and participation throughout. As a coalition, we have a zero tolerance policy for any kind of discrimination or violent or abusive behavior. Please reach out to myself or any of the hosts on this panel via the Zoom chat to report anything concerning. Next slide. So today's webinar is going to be heavy. We are going to be discussing the latest attack by this administration on our LGBTQ plus neighbors and friends, especially those who are experiencing homelessness or who are otherwise in need of housing assistance. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the Department of Housing and Urban Development's equal access rule and the recent proposed rule changes by the administration to gut the protections that are offered through that regulation, including and most critically the protections for transgender individuals who are seeking shelter or services funded through HUD's community planning and development programs. While the information that we're talking through today is disheartening, our goal is to also leave you with hope and an eagerness to take action. As I mentioned, we are a growing, there are many interested organizations, national partners who are joining together around this very important topic, standing alongside each other and with all of you through this fight. I think it's important to highlight that we've been preparing for this for over a year, following an executive order by President Trump, one of the first that he issued, directing HUD to rescind the equal access rule. So we knew that this was coming and we were ready for it. So here's what to expect from today's webinar. First, you're going to hear from me, providing an overview of the equal access rule, what it is, its history, and why it is so needed in our response to housing instability and homelessness. Next, we'll hear from Josh Dubinsky from Services and Advocacy for Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Elders, who's going to provide a breakdown of what exactly is in HUD's proposal. We're going to hear from a number of national partners, including the National AIDS Housing Coalition, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, the Interfaith Alliance, My Sister's House, about why this rule matters for their organizations and from their own experience. And then finally, we're going to hear from Linda Morris with the American Civil Liberties Union and Devin Ojeda from Advocates for Trans Equality on the importance of and how to take action to defend the rule and to sound alarm in your community. As you can see, we've got a very ambitious agenda, but we do hope to have a few minutes towards the end to answer some of your questions live. We have a number of other national partners as well who are answering questions in the Q&A box. All right, next slide. So I want to just talk through a little bit about the context and importance and why this matters, right? A little bit about how I'm coming into this conversation. So I was at HUD as a senior advisor of special needs programs when the Equal Access Rule was published and then later amended. And it always felt during those times, it felt like a long overdue policy rather than something that was radical. We understood the impact that discrimination had and continues to have on LGBTQ plus individuals and families, and the disproportionate impact of homelessness on transgender and gender expansive people in particular, with family rejection, discrimination, and ongoing stigma elevating their risk. Next slide. So what is the Equal Access Rule? We'll do a little bit of history walk here. So back in 2012, HUD published its final rule entitled Equal Access to Housing in HUD Programs Regardless of Sexual Orientation or Gender Identity. This rule was promulgated to ensure that HUD's housing programs would be open to all eligible individuals and families, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. And housing providers could not consider actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status in determining whether a group of people constitutes a family or household. The 2012 rule stopped short, however, of providing protection specifically for transgender individuals seeking shelter and assistance in a facility with shared bathing or sleeping spaces like many of the emergency shelters. So we spent time over the next few years really intentionally talking with impacted households, shelter operators, and other stakeholder groups to understand what protections would be needed. So that in 2016, we published a follow-up rule entitled Equal Access in Accordance with an Individual's Gender Identity and Community Planning and Development Programs that was informed by all of that great feedback. So the 2016 Equal Access Rule ensures equal access specifically to HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development, or CPD programs, and really specifically to shelters. In accordance with it ensures equal access to those programs and to shelters and other facilities, ensuring that placement into those spaces is in accordance with the shelter seeker's self-identified gender identity. The amendments constituted a crucial policy to improve the treatment of gender-expansive individuals and securing assistance when in crisis. This rule required that individuals, when they're in crisis and going to an emergency shelter or any space with shared sleeping or bathing areas, that they be accommodated based on their self-determined gender identity, not sex at birth, and providers could not ask intrusive questions or demand medical evidence. Instead, HUD emphasized that a person's own statement of gender identity governed placement decisions. And HUD's primary mechanism to enforce this rule was through reporting. And then so individuals or other organizations could report instances of discrimination, and then HUD would have to investigate that. This was one of the last major actions by HUD during the Obama administration's second term. It was also one of the first under attack when Trump became president the first time. Next slide. So just a brief timeline. Again, almost immediately after, or building off the timeline. So 2012, 2016, and then we got to Trump came into office the first time, and almost immediately, HUD began removing LGBTQ plus protections from any of HUD's funding priorities, and the protections were routine. Those protections that did exist were criticized by leaders. Enforcement actions were weakened. In 2020, there was another proposed rule that proposed changes that would have allowed, not mandated, but allowed HUD-funded shelters to consider biological sex, privacy concerns, and other considerations when deciding whether to admit or place transgender individuals in sex-segregated shelters. There was a huge mobilization effort by largely this group that you're going to be hearing from today and others, who mobilized and launched a campaign during the 60-day comment period in which organizations and individuals could submit their concerns. A historic 66,000 comments were submitted, the largest comment campaign that has ever happened on a HUD regulation. The results, it didn't go forward. They couldn't get it out during the remainder of Trump's first term. And when the Biden administration came into place, they withdrew that proposed rule, and it stayed in effect. So that brings us really to last year. Last year, almost immediately, there was an executive order by the White House that issued a directive to HUD Secretary to rescind the rule. After that, HUD Secretary issued a directive almost immediately, halting all enforcement of the Equal Access Rule, and then soon thereafter started the regulatory process. So now we're here, and we'll hear more about the rule itself and the comment period in just a moment. So the last thing I just want to touch on is reinforcing why this is so important. The need for these protections is rooted in both data and lived experience. Just this week, the Alliance published a brief highlighting the findings of the 2022 U.S. Trans Survey, which finds that transgender and gender expansive people in the United States face a disproportionately high risk of homelessness. Systemic discrimination, weak policy protections against discrimination, and social stigma drive this trend. The data reveals that nearly 1 in 3 respondents has experienced homelessness in their lifetime, 8 times the rate of the general population. 1 in 14 of those respondents reported having experienced homelessness just in the prior 12 months. People should not be scared of asking for help. And yet, even with the equal access rule protections that are in place, our gender expansive neighbors continue to overwhelmingly experience a disproportionate rate of homelessness, which has dire consequences. We cannot afford to go back. So I'm going to now hand it over to our colleague Josh, who's going to both help us move through the webinar and is going to talk more specifically about the current proposed rule.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcy. Now that we have an understanding of what the Equal Access Rule does and why it is so important, I want to walk through exactly what HUD is proposing. First, HUD is proposing a new regulatory definition of sex. The proposal removes all references to gender, gender identity, and actual or perceived sexual orientation. It replaces these terms with a new definition of sex, which it defines as an individual's immutable biological classification as either male or female. This change applies across non-discrimination reporting, record-keeping, and other regulatory provisions. Second, HUD has proposed a requirement that HUD-funded shelters discriminate against transgender people. The proposal requires all admissions, placement, and accommodation in temporary emergency shelters and other facilities with shared sleeping quarters or bathing facilities to be made in accordance with an individual's HUD-defined biological sex, rather than self-identified gender identity. The proposal also requires grantees to follow the new definitions or risk the loss of federal funds. This would be enforced even if states and local laws conflict with the new guidance and grantees are faced with a loss of state or local funding. Third, HUD has proposed granting permission for providers to require evidence of sex. The proposal removes prohibitions on inquiries into gender identity and allows providers to require reasonable assurances or evidence to establish a person's sex. Finally, HUD has proposed the removal of protections across HUD programs to defend against discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. Next slide. Now, HUD attempted to justify the need for these proposals, but it's done so with easily refutable claims. First, HUD cites Executive Order 14168, titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology, Extremism, and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government, as specifically directing the agency to prepare rulemaking to rescind the 2016 rule and remove any references to gender identity from agency regulations. But despite this directive from the White House being clear in its opposition to the Equal Access Rule, it does not provide sufficient legal authority to change definitions of words and eliminate civil rights protections. Second, HUD asserts that the agency does not have the authority to issue the Equal Access Rule, and the agency relied on the rationale that it is not authorized to expand for housing protections based on gender. However, The Bostock Supreme Court ruling, combined with the Fair Housing Act, provides the congressional and judicial direction required for HUD to issue the Equal Access Rule, in addition to HUD's general rulemaking authority. Third, HUD leans heavily into the claim that it has to repeal the Equal Access Rule in defense of women. HUD claims that the rule has increased the risk of sexual harassment and assault for women seeking shelter by requiring providers to house trans people in shared spaces. But HUD does not back up this assertion with any findings. HUD provides no evidence, data, or stories that the Equal Access Rule resulted in more women experiencing harassment or assault as a result of the Equal Access Rule. It is telling that in the decade plus that the EAR has been in place, HUD could not find any examples to cite for the public record that would back up this claim. In direct contradiction to HUD's claim, the last time HUD attempted to roll back these protections, over 300 domestic violence shelter providers signed on to a national letter in support of the Equal Access Rule. And fourth, HUD also relies on the claim that defending religious liberty is a key reason for needing to get rid of the Equal Access Rule. HUD claims that the rule violated the rights of faith-based service providers by requiring them to serve individuals against their religious beliefs. But again, HUD does not back up this claim with any evidence. There are no records of faith-based complaints from service providers pertaining to the EAR. HUD has also not responded to Freedom of Information Act requests recently seeking documentation of service providers who have requested a waiver. In the proposal to repeal the EAR recently released, HUD was only able to cite a single case of a faith-based provider challenging a shelter access rule, but the one example was unrelated to the federal Equal Access Rule and focused solely on a local city ordinance in Alaska. If HUD's true concern was the sincere objection of faith-based providers, it is unclear why they are proposing that every provider be forced to adhere to these beliefs, especially since authority already exists to grant limited waivers for just such circumstances. Moreover, numerous faith-based organizations opposed the effort to repeal the EAR in 2020 and continue to affirm the rights of LGBTQ+ people seeking shelter. The impact of the Equal Access Rule is broad, and HUD's proposal would be devastating. But the coalition fighting to preserve it reflects the strength and importance of this fight. Next, we're going to hear from partners representing many communities, and I'm pleased to turn it over to Lauren Banks.
Thanks so much. Josh, I'm Lauren Banks. I'm the executive director of the National HIV/AIDS Housing Coalition, and we are greatly concerned about this proposed rule to take away the Equal Access Rule because of the impact specifically on trans women living with HIV. I know that one of my colleagues from my sister's house, who is on the board of the National HIV/AIDS Housing Coalition, Michelle Anderson, will speak more to this. But I want to highlight a couple of facts, and that the CDC found a few years ago in some research done by Ruth Ann Marcus that 42% of trans women who were unhoused were living with HIV. So 42% of unhoused trans women were living with HIV. And in general, transgender people living with HIV, a third of those are unhoused. So we see right away, just from those two statistics, that the trans experience is synonymous with often being unhoused and with acquiring HIV. So people who are transgender and HIV also experience the most stigma of having HIV compared to their peers in other groups. Now, when someone is seeking shelter, as we know, who is unhoused, the homeless HMIS requires them to go and get proof of their homelessness. So going to a shelter for the purpose of verifying homelessness so that people can access resources. If this proposed rule goes through, that will require transgender people to go to a shelter that does not fit with their gender identity, thereby making them more vulnerable to violence, to humiliation, and of course, exacerbating stigma. HIV remains a communicable disease, and we know that this is about people's individual health and thriving, but also from an HIV public health lens, this is a public health issue. We need to make sure that people who are transgender and living with HIV are able to adhere to their medication. And housing is one of the biggest determinants of somebody being able to adhere to their medication. Medication gets stolen all the time. Stigma for HIV is still rampant. And so at the National HIV/AIDS Housing Coalition, we are encouraging people to submit comments and to take into account the impact on the HIV community, specifically for trans and non-binary persons. So thanks for having us on this call, and we look forward to working with all of you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And I'm next pleased to turn it over to Melina.
Thank you, Josh. Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Milazzo, Director of Policy for the National Network to End Domestic Violence. NNEDV, we are a membership and advocacy organization that represents the 56 state and territorial coalitions against domestic violence. There are 2,000 plus member domestic violence shelters and local programs, and the millions of survivors they serve every year. It's on this basis that I'm here to say in unequivocal terms that NNEDV strongly opposes weakening the equal access rule or eliminating protections it provides for transgender and non-binary people. The Equal Access Rule, or also known as EAR, and as we've heard, ensures that the federal housing services are not denied based on a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. In fact, the rule was originally issued so that all family members and familial makeups could all access the same shelter. The Equal Access Rule also provides critical protections for both domestic violence survivors and providers who serve them. EAR aligns with non-discrimination and accessibility legal requirements that are under the Violence Against Women Act and the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. These are core federal programs that fund domestic violence and sexual assault services across the country. In fact, VAWA protections ensure access to services regardless of sex and explicitly prohibits discriminating against survivors based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. EAR protects universal access to HUD resources, whether it's keeping a family united with their teenage son or protecting access to life-saving resources for a transgender person. This means that both shelter and housing programs, as well as survivors, have clear guidance and expectations under the law. The so-called justification used for rolling back the Equal Access Rule is the threat of harm women face in shelter. This myth is unfounded. There is no evidence of increased harm to women in shelters since the implementation of EAR. Non-discrimination laws protecting transgender people have existed for almost 50 years. Over 200 municipalities and 18 states have non-discrimination laws protecting transgender people's access to facilities consistent with their affirmed gender. These laws have protected transgender and non-binary people from discrimination without any evidence that they jeopardize others' safety. No jurisdiction has seen a rise in sexual violence or other public safety issues due to these non-discrimination laws. However, spreading anti-transgender rhetoric increases harm to a vulnerable community that already experiences high rates of physical and sexual violence. Transgender and non-binary individuals already suffer higher risks of domestic violence and sexual assault resulting from discrimination, stigma, and barriers to financial and housing security that they endure. Transgender women of color are disproportionately impacted. Prohibiting people from facilities consistent with their affirmed gender just further increases their vulnerability to assault and abuse. Discriminating against transgender and non-binary people threatens everyone's autonomy over their body and their safety. Those who spread falsehoods about transgender people and non-discrimination laws are endangering all people, making no one safer. Because of this, we encourage everyone, especially domestic violence and sexual assault organizations and direct service providers, to submit a comment opposing this proposed rule change. We ask you to share stories and examples of why it's important to maintain these critical protections for survivors. At NEDV, along with our national partners, will be providing a gender-based violence comment template to assist domestic violence and sexual assault organizations and providers in drafting their comments, and we will circulate it once it is finalized. Thank you all for attending and for having me, and I'll turn it back to Josh.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to hear from Guthrie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons, Vice President of Programs and Strategy at Interfaith Alliance, and I'm honored to be on this call with all of you today representing the faith community. Interfaith Alliance brings people together across our diverse religious traditions who are committed to ensuring that mainstream religious views are part of our public policy discussions, not just extreme anti-LGBTQ religious voices. I work in our national office in Washington, D.C., and we also have more than 30 local and state affiliated organizations around the country. We believe in our nation's long-standing commitment to religious freedom for all. Religious freedom is meant to be a shield that protects every one of us, never a sword that is used to harm our neighbors. The proposal to weaken the equal access rule is being framed in part as a victory for religious freedom, but that's simply not true. HUD claims this rollback is needed to relieve a burden on faith-based providers, but countless faith-based organizations have partnered with HUD under this rule for years and continue to do so without complaint. There is no evidence of burden. This proposed rule has little to do with religious freedom. It is simply about anti-trans discrimination. Federal social service programs should be centered on the people they serve and their rights, not on protecting a provider's ability to discriminate. Genuine religious freedom does not require the government to fund discrimination. It never has. What the equal access rule actually does is simple. It says when the public dollars pay for a shelter bed, a housing program, or emergency services, those doors stay open to everyone, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. No house of worship is forced to change its beliefs or compelled to do anything at all. The rule simply ensures that taxpayer-funded help reaches the people who need it most. And here is what I'd ask everyone to remember. This principle we're talking about today in the equal access rule is not a secular imposition on religion. It is a vibrant expression of faith for millions of Americans. The vast majority of faith communities running housing and shelter ministries do this work because of their faith. Nearly every religious tradition I know places welcome at its very center. The Hebrew scriptures command care for the stranger dozens of times. In the Gospels, Jesus teaches that how we treat the most vulnerable among us is how we treat God. Islam calls the faithful to shelter and protect those in need. Hospitality to the stranger is at the heart of many religious traditions. The equal access rule is about hospitality for all. When we weaken it, we are not protecting faith. We are betraying one of many faith traditions' oldest and most sacred obligations. We should also be honest about who is harmed. Trans and non-binary people are not strangers to faith communities. They're in our congregations, our families, our friends, the young people we have watched grow up in our pews. They are also among those at the very highest risk of homelessness in this country. When a trans woman fleeing violence is turned away from the only shelter in her county, that is a person of sacred, immeasurable worth left out in the cold. And people of faith should be the first to say that that is wrong. Religious freedom belongs to trans and non-binary people. Many are people of deep faith When the language of religion is used to push them out of safety, it doesn't just harm them, it diminishes everyone's religious freedom by pretending that religious freedom only belongs to some of us. So here's my charge to everyone on this call, especially my fellow people of faith. We carry moral authority into this comment period. When a clergy member, a congregation, or a faith-based provider says, "Not in our name," our tradition calls us to welcome, not turn away. Our testimony lands differently. It reframes this entire debate. And we are not new to this fight. Faith-based organizations opposed this very rollback in 2020, and they continue to affirm the rights of their LGBTQ neighbors seeking safety. Faith communities across the country are watching, and many of them are here with us in this coalition. So please submit a comment, and if you're a person of faith, speak as one when you submit your comment. Tell HUD that real religious freedom protects people, it never abandons them.
Great. Thank you so much, Guthrie. Next, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
All right, hello, can y'all hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Kayla. Sorry about that.
No problem. Michelle's not going to be here today. Hi, I'm Kayla Gore, the founder and executive director of My Sister's House and the Tiny House Project. It's located in Memphis, Tennessee. Thank you all for being here today. This swell of support really shows a lot. For more than a decade, My Sister's House has stood in the gap for Black transgender women in Memphis and across the South, particularly those who've been pushed to the margins by homelessness, poverty, violence, HIV vulnerability, incarceration, any type of discrimination that you can really think of. Our work has never been theoretical. It was born out of survival. It was born out of necessity. It was created by and for Black trans women who understood firsthand what it means to be denied safety, dignity, housing, and opportunity. Over the last 10 years, My Sister's House has developed a model rooted in community care, housing justice, and self-determination. Through emergency housing support, our tiny homes initiative, our direct services, our leadership development, political education, advocacy, and most importantly, our cultural organizing, where we have to ensure that trans people are not simply surviving, but they're building sustainable lives with dignity. The proposed repeal and the rollback of HUD's equal access rule threatens the very foundation of protections that many transgender people rely on to access shelter and housing safely. The current proposal will remove references to gender identity from HUD regulations and allow federally funded shelters and housing providers to determine access based on sex assigned at birth. Advocates across the housing and LGBTQ sector have warned that this would increase discrimination, homelessness, and violence against transgender people seeking shelters and services. For organizations like My Sister's House, this is not an abstract policy debate. This has real consequences for the people we serve every single day. We know what happens when trans women are denied access to affirming shelters. We know what happens when non-binary people are denied access to affirming shelter. And we know what trans masculine people, what happens when they're denied access to affirming shelters. We know that what happens when people are forced into unsafe environments, when they're misgendered, whether they're profiled, or if they're turned away altogether. Many of the people in our community have already experienced violence in shelters, housing instability, rejection from their family, criminalization, and any other barriers to employment simply because they're transgender. The Equal Access Rule was established to ensure that people across HUD-funded shelters and programs are housed in accordance with their gender identity without invasive questioning or discrimination. The current proposed rollback opens the door to harmful practices that force providers to police bodies and identities rather than providing care and housing. At My Sister's House, we believe housing is a human right. Safe shelter should never depend on whether someone conforms to narrow political definitions of gender, and we should be able to access those things safely. Trans people deserve housing. They deserve the ability to exist in public spaces without humiliation or fear. And despite these attacks, our commitment remains unchanged. We will continue building community-led solutions, advocating for equitable housing policies, and creating spaces where transgender people can live fully and safely. The work of MSH has always been about more than housing. It's about protecting humanity, affirming dignity, and ensuring that people most impacted have the power to shape their own futures. This moment requires courage from service providers, advocates, policymakers, and communities across this country. When we are stripped away from resources, and especially those who are the most vulnerable among us, the consequences are measured not in politics, but in human lives. That is why My Sister's House exists and has been in existence since 2016, because trans people in the South have not been able to access shelters until we had the equal access rule in place. I'm going to ask, just like everybody else has asked, please submit comments. And I'm pretty sure that most of the people on this call have already done that. So I'm encouraging you to ask your friends and ask your neighbors and ask your coworkers to also go and submit comments in support of continuing with the equal access rule. And I'll pass it back to you, Josh.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Now that we have a better understanding of the importance and breadth of support for the equal access rule, it's time to turn to focus on what we can really all do to protect us and delve into that a little more. We're currently in the key part of the process known as the public comment period, and I'm going to turn it over to Linda to talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks so much, Josh, and hi all. My name is Linda Morris. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I'm a senior staff attorney at the ACLU and our Women's Rights Project. I'll be sharing a brief overview of the administrative process and why this comment period is so important. So as Josh shared earlier during the presentation, the Equal Access Rule is a regulation that was adopted by HUD. And to make changes to that regulation, HUD is required by law to provide the public with advance notice of the proposed changes, as well as the opportunity to submit comments in response. And here, HUD has provided a 60-day period to submit comments, which closes on June 29th. Once that comment period closes, HUD is required to review and consider all of the comments that were submitted and to address those comments in finalizing the rule, either by making revisions to the proposed version or responding to them in other ways. And after that internal process is completed, HUD will publish the final rule so that it's codified as a federal regulation. And the timing of when that happens is pretty unpredictable and can depend on a few different factors, including how many comments are submitted and how long it takes HUD to review those comments. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Let's talk about why submitting a comment is so important in this fight. So the number one thing that I hope you all take away from me today is that your comment counts. And submitting a comment makes a meaningful and powerful difference in a number of different ways. So first, submitting public comments helps to build the record. So as we discussed just a few minutes ago, HUD is required to consider every comment in deciding what the final rule will say. And your comment will become part of the official record of what should have been considered by HUD when making changes to the equal access rule. And to be honest, while we have no reason to think that this administration will be influenced or moved by our comments, what we do know is that future administrations can and often do look to prior comments when deciding to change course or to undo a prior administration's actions. And building a record is also extremely important for any future litigation to challenge the rule. Lawyers rely on comments that were submitted to show that the changes in the rule will result in harms and costs and burdens to people, providers, communities, and to also show that the administration failed to consider any of those harms and costs, even though it was required to do so by law. And all of this is to say, again, your comment matters and your comment counts. And so each of you have a perspective, a story, an expertise, something to say that is critically important and that should be part of the record in this fight against these changes to the equal access rule. Submitting comments also does play other important roles, including that it helps to show the strength and the size of the opposition and the broader movement against these changes. and against the administration's attacks on the trans community. And it also provides a really powerful opportunity for collective action and care, especially to support the trans community, and also at a time when many of us are looking for ways to take action. And so again, please consider submitting comments. Please consider encouraging your friends, your coworkers, your colleagues, your family to submit comments as well. This is a critical fight, and we need everyone to show up. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Josh.
Thank you so much. And we'll turn to our final speaker, Devin, who's going to go over the resources that we have now to help folks draft and submit their comments.
Hi, everyone. My name is Devin Ojeda. My pronouns are he, him. I am the Senior National Organizer for Advocates for Trans Equality, and I just wanted to show you what our website looks like and our coalition that we've developed. It's a little bit complicated, but, once you go through it, it should only take, a few minutes to do. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. So as you see, this is our page. I know Alec has been sharing the website to you all. If you scroll down, you'll see an overview of the rule itself. There's some FAQs on about the rule, about how to comment, how the public comments work. We also have a few guidance and templates, a social media and email toolkit if you're an organization that wants to share things. We have an info sheet from SAGE, and then the National Alliance to End Homelessness info sheet and comment drafting guidance and templates as well. If you scroll down a little bit more, you can see here a link to submit a comment. This will lead you to this link, which is also a link that you can also separately access at action.transequality.org/a/equal-access rule. Again, more information about what the rule entails, a place to take action now. So here's the form that we use. As you can see, my information is already on there. Just FYI, you don't have to use your name if you're afraid. You can actually use an alias. You can change the name here to say whatever you want. It doesn't necessarily have to be your name. I do want to say that once it gets posted in the public forum, it is public for everyone. So I also wanted to emphasize that if you don't feel safe to have your name out there, you can also change it to any alias that you want, any name that you want. We also have optional questions here. Of course, if you don't feel comfortable answering them, you don't have to. This is for our internal purposes. It would not go to the federal government whatsoever. And then you scroll down and you click next, and then you'll see you can personalize your comment here. What I've done, I've already drafted a comment already, so I'll put that there. It's important that it has to be unique. Make it your own. Share your story. To explain why shelters are so important, not just for just trans people, but for queer people and for gay and lesbian, bisexual folks, and then, and even people who have different marital statuses. So please make this comment your own. And then you click next here, and it will pop up this page right here. And you'll see your comments right here. And all you have to do is copy your comment and then click on this button, submit on regulations.gov. And then it will send you to regulations.gov if it loads. There it is. And then you'll see the website here. And here's the comment box. All you have to do is press paste. If you feel uncomfortable having this, having your name and the location, you can always erase that. But your comment should be here. If you scroll down, you can also have the choice of either being an individual that represents yourself, or you can click anonymous. Obviously let the page know that you're not a robot. Here, let me do this quickly. and then oh come on, um, I'm not a robot, I promise. And then verify, and then all you have to do is submit comment, and that's how you submit your comment. The other thing is, if you want to save this step for later, you could also every action will send you an email and send you the comment of your email, so you can copy and paste it at a later time as well. Our email will send you the comment that you drafted and direct you back to this web page. And I think that's it. We have toolkits on our website that if you want to mobilize folks, I'm also going to leave some links for you all and in my email if you have any questions. And if you're an organization that wants to help us mobilize, let us know. There's a Google form as well if you want to be part of the coalition, help us mobilize more comments. Last time we did this, we were able to get 60K comments. It is probably one of the reasons why the Trump administration or the current administration has couldn't pass this rule, but we're hoping to do something similar this round as well. So we're really focusing on mobilizing folks, and I think that's all I have. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Devin, and thank you to all of our speakers. Now we have some time left over. We can do the question and answer. So I'll ask the speakers to turn on their cameras, and we'll be able to address some of the questions that came up throughout. All right. And I think first I want to kick it off with a question that's come up numerous times. I think a lot of us have heard. Also came up in the chat too. And I'll read part of it from a friend, Laurel. Comment period includes details about gender identity and current/former experiences of homelessness. With the administration's crackdown on organizers promoting transgender ideology, quote unquote, is it safe for trans people to disclose their identities in this public comment? That's the first part of the question. And I'll expand it as well, not only transgender individuals, but also we've heard this concern from service providers as well. Service providers who are afraid to submit comments because they're worried about this administration has made it very clear they're not worried about targeting people who they see as opponents. So folks on the panel, I wanted to ask, what would you say to individuals, organizations who are supportive of the rule? They would like to submit a comment, but they are worried about what it means if they could be targeted by the administration. Are there protections in place? What are the steps they could consider taking to either stay anonymous or kind of protect their work going forward?
Josh, I'm happy to start, at least on the service provider side of things. I mean, this is a time where it feels like there's risk in everything we do. So I just want to qualify anything I'm about to say as that exists. But what we've been saying to providers that have expressed that concern is that there's a way to express um, what you know about your organization and the people that you serve, the value that that the equal access rule has had, not just on transgender folks and LGBTQ plus folks, but really to the whole population of people seeking assistance. And it's almost an opportunity to provide education rather than speaking in a way that is, you're wrong, you're awful, you're this, you're that, and really just focusing on the facts and laying it out in that sort of way feels like a way to do it without siding one way or the other from a policy administrative stance.
This is Linda. I can jump in, I think, a little bit on the question about protections. Submitting a public comment is a constitutionally protected activity. And so the government cannot punish you or retaliate against you for submitting a public comment, whether it's in opposition or support of any agency action. Obviously, that doesn't mean that the government won't do that, but I guess what I would say is, just know that is your right. And for what it's worth, I guess I'd also just make two other points. So the ACLU has submitted comments on a number of different issues, often in opposition to the agency's actions. We've also worked with many different service providers and organizations to help them submit comments as well. And to my knowledge, none of those that I've worked with have ever experienced any retaliation because of their submission of a public comment. Again, that's not to say it can't happen, and never to say the risk is zero, but just wanted to offer that perspective and maybe just point of reference. And then the last thing I'll say is, I think what you put in your comment is always up to you. And so if you are someone who's questioning whether you want to disclose personal details about your identity, about your family's experience or your experience, that's completely up to you and your choice. You don't need to disclose those things. And so you can always give a lot of thought and care to what feels comfortable to you. You can still express opposition and raise concerns with the proposed rule without necessarily sharing your experience and the details about your identity. So those are my 2 cents.
Thank you. Any other comments to that question from the panelists? All right. Yeah, I'll emphasize too, it's the anonymous part is key as well. If you have a lot that you would like to say, it's important you can submit it anonymously, right? You can submit as a provider, but not provide information, as an individual who's experienced homelessness, but not provide those identifying information. So that's something that's open to you. When Devin walked through, it showed where you could submit anonymously. So those are important. Don't think just because you don't attach your name or your email that story isn't an important part of the record. That still would be. So please consider still attaching your story, even if you leave all your identifying information out. That's still an important part. Another question to think about is, from the panel, are there any tips you have for submitting really impactful comments? Things that would help folks to have the biggest impact when they're writing, when they're drafting, and encouraging others to submit. One thing we focus on is doesn't have to be long, right? That long does not always equal better when it comes to comments. So ideas for folks when they're considering what they're going to draft.
Oh, I'll start with this one. I always encourage people to be really concise. If they have a personal story, whether it's their own personal story or a story of a family member or a friend who's experienced discrimination prior to the equal access rule, I think that really helps. If it's coming from an organizational standpoint, I talked about the need and the necessity of starting and creating my sister's house in the South during a time where trans people were, um, you know, invasive questions. More so me asked the invasive questions about trans people as I was the mediator between community and a lot of the organizations that provided housing here in Memphis and Shelby County. So I talked a lot about not a lot, but I put a little information in there on the necessity of organizations like ours and the implications of removing the equal access rule and how that will weigh on our resources that are already small and few, that it would really probably shut us down.
Josh, if I can just add to what's already been shared, is that I would also say that, and this might go a little bit to also the previous question, is uh, to you can be strong in your opposition, but try to be respectful in your language. And also I would definitely try to stick to the facts, stick to what you know, because you don't necessarily want to be dismissed because, oh, you said something and you may have exaggerated something here or there, and you can be easily dismissed. And then the last thing I would say, or not the last thing, the second to last thing I'll say is definitely share stories, focus on the impact this is going to have on individuals, on your community, on organizations, rather than sort of the politics of it all. And then the last thing that I will add is try to make it as unique as possible, because what's more important than length of a comment is the number of comments. And if you are submitting all the same comments, they may just lump those together and count it as one comment versus 100 comments, for example. And what we really want is to have a high volume of unique comments because that will delay them from, because they'll have to respond to all the unique comments. So that will delay them in actually having to put forward this rule change.
Josh, can I add to that just a little bit? As somebody who has done regulation development and writing and responded to public comments, the federal government has a responsibility to respond to, as we just heard, to every unique comment. And not just like in the words that you use, but on unique topics or issues that you're raising about the rule itself feels really important. So tying your comments to specific sections and specific parts of the proposal feels really important. For example, the requirement around allowing the language that would allow providers to require evidence. What does that mean? Who would that exclude? Would that actually impact a much broader group of people, even beyond the group that they're targeting, who don't have documents? We know people experiencing homelessness in general have issues and barriers around having IDs and documents in general. So being able to raise this in ways to tie these to the broader impact, the specific impact, and tie it to the specific elements of the rule feels critically important.
Great. I don't think anyone else from the panel want to weigh in. All right, we're coming up on time, and I think maybe a good final question was one that came in from friend Nell, who was asking about just general questions about the comment period, and probably from a lot of folks in general who aren't used to working on this side, is there's probably a lot of still people feeling skeptical about does submitting to the comment period, is that going to help? They mentioned that they're appreciative of us really going over about what has worked in the past, but and why this is important. But especially with everything going on from the Trump administration, from HUD, what is there any additional advice or information folks want to say that can help folks when they're trying to convince more people to submit comments about why this is impactful now, why this is important and worthwhile? I know I like to think about focusing on there are a lot fewer federal protections than people might think that specifically call out and support the LGBTQ plus community, right? And HUD, this equal access rule is one of them. And the Trump administration has specifically decided to target it. And if it goes down, that's one of the big pillars in place. And they're trying to do it during Pride Month, right? That's one big thing to really focus on. Is this one of the strong things in place? But I wanted to also turn it over to the panels about other things that really help people understand why getting involved in this public comment period for the equal access rule is worthwhile, why it's worth the fight.
I would say that we shouldn't dismiss people's concerns. These aren't normal times. It does take courage right now. And so I just want to thank everyone on the call for having courage, for submitting a comment, for asking other people in your networks to submit comments. Everything we're doing, submitting a comment may seem like something small, but across the administration, we're seeing an attempt to limit dissent or limit any sort of or who gets a say in our democracy. And so this is an act of courage and hope that we will have a democracy where this kind of comment period can proceed by us all engaging in it.
I want to lift up something too that that is funny, and that the proposed rulemaking does not discuss intersex persons at all, and does it and really angles it from the perspective of trans women going into a shelter, and not at all about trans men. So I think that we have an opportunity in writing our rules to sort of to lift up a lot of things that they didn't cover, and show how weak their argument is just by simply naming some things. So thank you to Guthrie. I think it is certainly a brave thing to do, but necessary for many folks who don't have access to submit these comments and maybe don't know all that's going on, or who are young people today who are counting on us.
Kayla?
Yeah, I always go to this quote by Zora Neale Hurston. If you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. So that's what I always tell people is like, even if you are feeling defeated throughout this process with the equal access rule, we've been talking about it for a few years now. Um, if you say nothing, the history will say that this was okay with us and this was okay by you. So if you are feeling like that, just yeah, think about that.
Thank you so much, Kayla. I think that's a perfect way to end it and thinking about those ramifications and the long-term implications about submitting this comment. I know we might not have been able to get to every question, but we will be following up with a copy of this recordings, resources to talk about everything that Devin mentioned, as well as ways to contact folks if there are questions we didn't get to. I just wanted to thank everyone so much for taking the time to sit here, learn about the equal access rule and the comment period. Thank you for all the speakers. Thank you for folks who helped answering questions. And again, thanks for everyone for coming out and supporting the equal access rule, the trans community, and working together to fight back against this attempt to try to erase an entire part of the population and get rid of important rights that everyone benefits from. So thank you so much, everyone. And we're going to be in touch and fighting together to keep this in place. Thank you.